The gravel crunched like brittle bones beneath the tires as Sarah and Ryan's car meandered up the winding mountain road. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, slanting through the dense pine forest like liquid gold. Shadows stretched long and skeletal, flickering ominously across their windshield. Sarah leaned forward, squinting as the cabin emerged at the end of the dirt path. It looked exactly as it had in the photos, quaint and rustic, with weathered wooden walls and a wraparound porch adorned with a creaking wooden swing. The view beyond was breathtaking, a sprawling valley blanketed by evergreens that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. But despite its picturesque setting, something about the cabin's isolation felt wrong. Emily, the host, had provided clear instructions in her email. Keys under the mat. Enjoy the quiet and the stars. This is the perfect place to escape the chaos of the world. Sarah bent to retrieve the key, while Ryan began unloading their bags, humming tunelessly as he hauled them onto the porch. The front door creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing the interior. Cozy yet unnervingly sterile. The wooden floors gleamed as if freshly polished. The furniture, a mismatched collection of antiques, looked untouched, as if placed there only for show. A stone fireplace loomed in the living room, its logs stacked with unsettling precision. "It's nice," Sarah murmured, though her voice carried a note of hesitation. "Nice," Ryan grinned, tossing their bags onto a well-worn leather sofa. "This place is a dream. We're finally off the grid, Sarah. No emails, no deadlines, just us." Sarah forced a smile and ran a hand along the smooth surface of the coffee table. On it sat an old guest book, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. Flipping it open, she scanned the handwritten messages left by previous visitors. "Magical retreat. Love the sunsets. Perfect getaway. Can't wait to come back. The stars here are unreal. Felt like we could touch them." But as she neared the final pages, her fingers hesitated over an entry, written in jagged, hurried strokes. "The cabin is beautiful, but the nights are wrong. Felt like we weren't alone. Won't stay again." Sarah stared at the words, a chill running down her spine. She showed the page to Ryan, who read it and scoffed. "People get paranoid in places like this," he said dismissively, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Come on, we're here to relax, not scare ourselves." But Sarah couldn't shake the unease that lingered, like a splinter buried just beneath her skin. As night descended, the forest beyond the cabin grew eerily quiet. The usual symphony of chirping crickets and rustling leaves was conspicuously absent. Instead, there was only the faint whisper of the wind, brushing against the cabin walls like a restless breath. Inside, the fireplace crackled warmly, its glow casting dancing shadows across the room. Ryan, ever the optimist, had opened a bottle of wine and was sprawled on the couch, flipping through an old paperback. Sarah sat beside him, her attention divided between the book she was pretending to read and the oppressive silence outside. "I don't hear any animals," she said suddenly, breaking the stillness. "Maybe they are just shy," Ryan replied without looking up. Sarah frowned, her eyes drifting to the darkened windows. She couldn't explain it, but she felt exposed, like someone or something was watching them from the trees. The hours ticked by, and Ryan eventually drifted off to sleep, his snores filling the quiet room. Sarah stayed awake, her senses on edge. Just after midnight, she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible, like the soft crunch of gravel beneath cautious footsteps. She froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Slowly, she crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The porch was empty. The forest, still. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, prickling at the back of her neck. "Sarah," Ryan mumbled groggily from the couch. "Come to bed." Reluctantly, she left the window and climbed the stairs to the loft bedroom. As she settled into bed beside him, she told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. But deep down, she knew better. Morning arrived with a hazy, pale light that barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees. Over breakfast, Sarah found herself glancing repeatedly at the windows, searching for some sign of the disturbance from the night before. It wasn't until Ryan stepped out onto the porch to stretch that he saw them. Sarah? His voice was laced with unease. She joined him outside and froze. The gravel path leading up to the cabin was marked by a trail of footprints. They were too large to be human, yet they weren't animal tracks either. The prints were uneven, with deep grooves, as if whatever had made them was dragging something heavy behind it. Probably just a bear, Ryan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Bears don't walk like that, Sarah whispered, her eyes tracing the path of the prints as they disappeared into the dense forest. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Sarah insisted they keep the cabin doors locked, but Ryan dismissed her fears, insisting they were overreacting. By evening, the unease had reached a fever pitch. The cabin, which had seemed charming and cozy just yesterday, now felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The second night was worse. The forest, which had been eerily silent before, now seemed alive with strange noises, whispers carried on the wind, faint rustling in the underbrush, and the occasional distant snap of a branch. Sarah lay wide awake in the dark, her heart pounding with every sound. Around 2 a.m., she heard it again, the crunch of gravel. But this time it was accompanied by another sound, a low, guttural scraping, like metal dragging against stone. "Ryan," she hissed, shaking him awake. He groaned but sat up when he saw the fear in her eyes. Together they crept to the window and peered out. At first they saw nothing. The porch was empty, the forest still. But then, in the faint moonlight, they saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the tree line. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and jerky as it moved. "What the hell is that?" Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. Before Sarah could answer, the shadow stopped. For a moment it stood completely still, as if sensing their gaze. And then, with a sudden, unnatural speed, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Here's the continuation of the last guest. Neither Sarah nor Ryan slept for the rest of the night. They sat huddled in the living room, the fire long extinguished, listening intently to every creak and groan of the cabin. The warmth they had felt when they first arrived was gone, replaced by an oppressive chill that seemed to seep into their bones. By morning, the fear had settled into a gnawing paranoia. They debated leaving, but Ryan argued against it. "It's probably just some animal," he said, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his own doubts. "We're in the middle of the forest, Sarah. Weird stuff happens. We paid for the weekend. Let's not let some creepy noises ruin it." Sarah wanted to argue, but something told her it wouldn't matter. Whatever was out there, it wouldn't let them leave so easily. As they prepared breakfast, Sarah noticed something strange about the guest book. It was closed, but when she picked it up, she realized it was heavier than before. She flipped it open and gasped. The pages, which had been full of cheerful messages just the day before, were now blank, all except for the last page, where a single line had been scrawled in thick, black ink. "It comes closer at night." Her breath caught in her throat. She showed the book to Ryan, but he dismissed it as a prank. "Maybe Emily's got a weird sense of humor," he said, though his tone was less convincing now. But Sarah wasn't so sure. She spent the day watching the woods, the nagging sense of being watched never leaving her. By the time the sun began to set, the cabin was steeped in an oppressive quiet. The kind of quiet that feels alive, as though it's holding its breath. Sarah and Ryan locked all the doors and windows before retreating upstairs to the loft. "I'm sure it's nothing," Ryan said as he double-checked the locks on the bedroom door. "We're safe here." But Sarah didn't feel safe. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in her body tense. Then just past midnight, it began again. The crunch of gravel outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. "Ryan," she whispered, shaking him awake. He sat up, groggy but alert. "What is it?" "Listen," she said, her voice barely audible. The sound grew louder, moving closer. This time it didn't stop at the porch. There was a heavy thud as something stepped onto the wooden boards. Ryan grabbed the fireplace poker they'd brought upstairs earlier, holding it like a makeshift weapon. They crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first they saw nothing, but then the porch swing moved, not gently like it had been stirred by the wind, but violently, as if someone had shoved it. And then they heard it. The door. It wasn't a knock. It was a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wood. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ryan didn't answer. He was staring at the door, his grip on the poker tightening. The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of the doorknob rattling, as though something was testing it. "It's locked," Ryan whispered, more to himself than to Sarah. "It can't get in." But then the door creaked. Slowly it began to open, the lock offering no resistance. Sarah and Ryan backed away as the door swung open, revealing nothing. The hallway was empty, the darkness beyond the doorway impenetrable. Ryan moved forward cautiously, the poker raised. "Stay here," he whispered. "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. But he shook her off and stepped into the hallway. Sarah watched as he disappeared into the shadows, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "Ryan," she called after a moment. No answer. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Then suddenly Ryan's scream shattered it. "Sarah, run!" he yelled, his voice laced with terror. She didn't wait to see what had happened. Grabbing her phone, she bolted down the stairs and out the front door. Not caring about the footprints or the shadows, she ran into the woods, the cold air burning her lungs. Behind her, she heard footsteps, heavy, uneven, and getting closer. She dared not look back. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches clawing at her clothes and hair. The moonlight barely filtered through the canopy, casting the forest in an eerie, bluish glow. Sarah stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could still hear the footsteps behind her, relentless and unhurried, as though whatever was chasing her knew she couldn't escape. Then she saw it, a faint light in the distance. A house? A car? She didn't know, but it was her only hope. She pushed herself harder, her legs screaming in protest. But as she got closer, her heart sank. The light wasn't coming from a house or a car. It was coming from the cabin. She had somehow circled back. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The front door of the cabin stood open, light spilling out onto the porch. And standing in the doorway was Ryan. "Sarah," he called, his voice strangely calm. "It's okay. Come inside." She froze, her instincts screaming at her to run. Something about him was wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural. His head tilted slightly to one side as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "Sarah," he said again, his voice lower now, almost a growl. "Come inside." And then she saw it, the shadow standing just behind him, its elongated limbs wrapped around his shoulders, like a puppet master holding its strings. Sarah turned and ran, her screams swallowed by the endless forest. Chapter 9. The Endless Loop. Sarah ran blindly through the forest, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her breath came in sharp, panic bursts as she darted through the dense underbrush, branches clawing at her skin like unseen hands. The cabin's light faded behind her, and the darkness grew thicker, oppressive, wrapping around her like a living thing. But no matter how far she ran, she could still hear it. The heavy, uneven footsteps that seemed to echo her own. It wasn't just following her, it was everywhere. Time lost meaning as she stumbled through the forest. Was it hours? Minutes? She didn't know. The cold air burned her lungs and her legs trembled with exhaustion. Yet she didn't stop. She couldn't. And then she saw it again. The light. Her stomach dropped as she realized she was back where she'd started. The cabin loomed in front of her, its door still wide open. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like beckoning hands. "No!" No, 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 she whispered, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. She turned to run again, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the cold, damp ground. The footsteps stopped. Slowly, she turned her head. The forest behind her was empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. It was as if the trees themselves were leaning in, their gnarled branches reaching for her. And then she heard it. Sarah. The voice was soft, almost familiar but wrong, stretched, distorted. She turned back toward the cabin, her heart hammering in her chest. Ryan stood in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. Sarah, come inside, he said, his tone eerily calm. Stay away from me, she screamed, scrambling to her feet. But he stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His face came into view and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was Ryan, but not. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely black, like twin voids. A thin, unnatural smile stretched across his face, too wide to be human. Sarah, he said again, his voice dropping into a guttural growl. You can't leave. None of us can. Behind him, the shadow emerged. It unfolded from the doorway like smoke, its form shifting and writhing, as if it were barely tethered to reality. Tall and spindly, its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, and his head tilted toward her as if studying her. Sarah turned and ran, her screams echoing through the forest. She didn't know how long she ran this time. The forest felt endless, a labyrinth of darkness and shadows that twisted and turned, pulling her deeper into its depths. The footsteps followed, relentless, growing louder with every passing second. And then she tripped. Her body hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She clawed at the dirt, trying to pull herself up, but her limbs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding her down. The footsteps stopped. She didn't dare look up, but she felt it, something standing over her, its presence suffocating. Slowly, the sound of breathing filled the air, low and rasping, like wind through dead leaves. Why? She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Why us? The breathing paused, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, cold and hollow, like the echo of something long dead, answered. You were invited. Her mind raced, desperate to make sense of the words. Invited by who? And then she remembered the guest book, the cryptic warning scrawled in its final pages. It comes closer at night. This wasn't just a cabin. It was a trap. The voice spoke again, this time closer, as if it were whispering directly into her ear. They never leave. Neither will you. She screamed, her voice tearing through the stillness as the shadow descended. Sarah woke to sunlight filtering through the trees. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare, but as she sat up, she realized she was lying on the cabin porch. The door was closed, the forest quiet. She stood slowly, her body aching, and tried the door. It creaked open easily, revealing the cabin's eerily pristine interior. The fireplace was unlit, the furniture untouched. Ryan, she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. She searched the cabin, every room, but he was gone. The only sign he'd ever been there was his jacket, draped over the back of the couch. Desperate, she grabbed her phone, but there was no signal, just the same blank screen that had greeted her since they arrived. Then she saw it, the guest book sitting on the coffee table. Her hands shook as she opened it, flipping past the blank pages to the final entry. This time, the words were written in her own handwriting. I should have listened. I should have left. Now it's too late. The door slammed shut behind her, and the cabin fell into darkness. Weeks later, a new couple arrived at the cabin. They laughed as they unpacked their bags, marveling at the breathtaking view and the cozy interior. On the coffee table, they found the guest book. Look at all these messages, the woman said, flipping through the pages. So many people love this place. Her partner smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's perfect, isn't it? No distractions, no one around for miles. She turned to the last page, her brow furrowing. It comes closer at night. What does that mean? Her partner shrugged. Probably just someone trying to be funny. Come on, let's enjoy this place. As night fell, the cabin grew silent, and the footsteps began again. The end.